Rai non concret. A man screaming inches from her face. Unsat gear. Kira Vance counted his pulse by the light on his neck. 110. 115. A spike. One mistake, and her hand would finish the thought. "Don't blink," he said. "I will." The clock wasn't a timer. It was his breath between words. Vance stood rigid in the pre-dawn dark. The Coronado foghorn blasted twice, a low vibration that rattled the fillings in her teeth. It was the only thing loud enough to compete with Senior Chief Maddock. He was close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, layered over the pervasive stench of the grinder. A nauseating cocktail of simple green industrial cleaner and rotting kelp. "I am talking to you." "Recruit," Maddock roared. Spittle hit her cheek, warm against the freezing rain. "Are you deaf? Or just stupid?" "No, Chief," Vance said. Her voice was flat. A dead wire. She stared through him, focusing on the sodium perimeter lights buzzing overhead, like angry insects. A high volte hum trailing into her skull. Looking at his eyes meant analyzing pupil dilation. Looking at his stance meant calculating the center of gravity, so she watched the rivets on the water tower behind him. She was numb, not the shivering chill civilians complained about in line for a latte. This was a deep, metabolic freeze. The abrasion of wet sand, sugar cookies, grinding inside dry socks. Every shift of her weight sent sandpaper friction across her blistered heels. The pain was a dull, rhythmic throb. It was good. It kept her here. It kept her a recruit. "You think you're special." Maddock invaded the negative space around her. "You think because you scraped through the fleet you can stand on my deck with a loose thread." He yanked the thread on her shoulder pocket. The fabric tore. The sound was sharp, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. Vance's right hand twitched. It was a micro movement. Synapses firing before thought. Muscle memory. Y hand to larynx. Pivot. Collapse. 0.8 seconds. He was leaning forward, exposing his carotid to the yellow light, begging for it. "Stop." She clamped her hand to her side. The seam of her trousers bit into her thumb. Clear leather leads to paperwork. She forced her breathing to decouple from her heart rate. She wasn't an operator. She was Recruit Vance. Mediocre. Grey paint on the bulkhead. "Gear failure," Maddock shouted. "Drop." Vance dropped. Her palms hit the wet concrete, sending a shockwave up her wrists. The water was oily, slick with truck runoff. "Push." She pushed. 1. The rain intensified. She focused on the mechanics. Triceps engaging. Core tightening. Simple physics. Gravity versus leverage. No politics. No threat assessments. Just wait. "You're slow." Maddock circled her like a shark, sensing blood. The wet thud of his boots was heavy. Deliberate. "You're lagging?" Vance, holding up my class. "Yes, Chief." She grunted on the upswing. "Why are you here?" He stopped near her head. "Met on his boat too." "You don't have the eyes for this. I see you looking at the exits, counting steps. You're scared." Vance paused at the top of the extension. Water dripped from her nose. He was wrong. She wasn't scared of the pain or the shouting. She was scared of the silence. Scared of what happened when the shouting stopped, and her brain had nothing to process but memories of things breaking under her hands. She counted his heartbeats again. Footsteps heavy, agitated, high blood pressure. He wasn't acting. He genuinely hated her. He smelled a lie. "I asked you a question." Maddock dropped his voice. A tactical whisper. "Dangerous. Why are you here?" Vance lowered herself. Icy water soaked her chest. "To learn?" "Chief." Maddock laughed. A dry sound, like leaves on pavement. Liar, you're here to hide. Vance froze, arms locked. For a second, the mask slipped. She looked up. Maddock looked down, face shadowed. He took out his Zippo. A sharp click erupted. Flame flared orange. A mechanical clack followed. Darkness. A rhythmic clicking and clacking filled the air. A nervous tick. An anchor. He was thinking, I'm going to break you. Vance? He said softly. The flame illuminated his jaw. I'm going to peel you back until I find the rot underneath. You're a tourist. I don't let tourists walk my deck. He kicked water into her face. Grit hit her eyes. Recover. Get out of my face. Ugh. Vance scrambled up, blinking away the pain. She stood at attention, vibrating with the effort of stillness. Chief. Maddock turned, walking into the gloom, the Zippo marking his position like a beacon. Vance stood alone. The foghorn blasted again. 2 notes. She rubbed the inside of her left forearm, feeling the scar tissue through wet fabric. The Veritas brand. An itch she couldn't scratch. Pulse 45. Calm. Numb. Hidden. But Maddock had the scent. He was a hunter. For the first time, Vance felt a flicker of something that wasn't boredom. The hunt flickered awake. The door to the instructor's hut slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the rain. Senior Chief Harlan Maddock peeled off his wet cover and threw it onto the metal desk. It landed with a heavy, sodden slump. The office smelled of stale coffee burnt on the burner, and the wet wool of his own sweater. It was the smell of bureaucracy, of long nights spent pushing paper instead of pushing limits. Maddock hated it. He ran a hand through his cropped grey hair, shaking off the water. His fingers found the Zippo in his pocket. The flint struck steel. A burst of orange fire. Darkness. A rhythmic clicking and clacking sound filled the room. His thumb worked the wheel in a frantic rhythm. He stared at the water pooling on the linoleum floor from his boots. He wasn't thinking about the cold. He was thinking about Recruit Vance. There was something wrong with her. Not the usual wrong. The weakness. The entitlement. The fear. He could smell those. He could break those. This was different. When he'd torn her uniform, when the fabric snapped, she hadn't flinched away. She had twitched toward him. He knew that twitch. It pulled a trigger in his memory, dragging him back to a dusty safe house in Kandahar. The air thick with the copper tang of blood and unwashed bodies. A prisoner on his knees, seemingly broken, until that same microspasm in the shoulder. A shift of weight that looked like a flinch, but was actually a loading sequence. 2 seconds later, the interrogator was bleeding out on the dirt floor. That twitch wasn't fear. It was the safety coming off. It was ghosts rising from body bags. You're not a recruit, Maddock muttered to the empty room. You're a liability. He sat down, the chair groaning under his weight. He woke the computer terminal. The screen hummed to life, washing the dim room in a harsh blue glow. He didn't want a superstar on his deck. He didn't want a mystery. He wanted the standard. The standard kept people alive. If Vance was hiding something, she was a crack in the hull. And cracks spread. He logged into the Navy Standard Integrated Personnel System. His thick fingers flew across the keyboard, typing with the brute force of a man used to handling heavy machinery. He navigated to the personnel lookup. Name: Vance, Kira. Rank: A1. Recruit. Service record: Fleet transfer. It looked clean. Too clean. Generic commendations. Generic transfers. It was the kind of paperwork generated by a rubber stamp, not a human being. It had no texture. No friction. Maddock leaned closer, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. He cracked his knuckles. He was going to find the gap. Maybe a DUI in high school. Maybe a psych evil that didn't sit right. He entered the deeper query code, overriding the standard view with his senior chief authorization. He punched in her social security number. He hit enter. The screen froze. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the blue light died. A block of red text erupted across the monitor, pulsing like a warning beacon. Access denied. Level 5 SCI NOFORN. Terminal logged. Maddock blinked. The Zippo fell silent in his hand. Level 5. He had clearance for nuclear weapons, transport manifests. He had clearance for SEAL team deployments. Level 5 was ghost tier. It was intelligence support activity. It was things that didn't exist. What the hell? He whispered. The phone on his desk rang. It wasn't a normal ring. It was a jarring, mechanical shriek that made him jump. The red screen pulsed in time with the sound. Maddox stared at the handset. It looked like a coiled snake. The office felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. The smell of burnt coffee seemed to turn acrid, like ozone. He reached out. His hand hovered. He was a senior chief. He didn't fear phone calls. But the text on the screen, terminal logged, meant they were watching. Right now. He picked up the receiver. He didn't speak. He listened. There was no background noise, no static, just a voice. It didn't sound human. It sounded like gravel grinding through a synthesizer, stripped of gender and cadence. Senior Chief Maddock. Maddock swallowed. His throat felt dry as dust. Who is this? Loaf? The voice said. It was flat, monotone, terrifyingly calm. Forget the name. Forget the query. This is your only warning. A sharp click followed. The line went dead. Maddox slowly lowered the phone. His heart was hammering against his ribs. A heavy, panicked rhythm that matched the rain pounding on the roof. He looked at the screen. It had reset to the login prompt, innocent and blank. He sat back, breathing hard. The silence in the room was heavy, oppressive. They were watching her, protecting her, which meant she wasn't just a recruit. She was a dangerous asset. And if she snapped on his grinder, if that twitch became a strike, people would die. He picked up his Zippo again. A sharp click sounded. The flame was steady, but his hand wasn't. He couldn't fire her. They wouldn't let him. But he could break her. He could make her quit. He could make the grinder so unbearable that she would ring the bell herself. Level 5 or not. Safety risk, he decided. The logic solidifying, like concrete in his mind. You're gone. 1,000 hours. The sun had burned off the mist, leaving the asphalt baking under a white, hazy sky. The heat shimmer blossomed off the perimeter road, distorting the chain-link fence into liquid silver. Vance was dying. Or rather, she was simulating the biomechanics of dying. A rhythmic thudding of boots hit the tarmac in a ragged, syncopated rhythm. It sounded like a failing engine. Her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and hot ash. Every breath was a negotiation with her ribcage. She kept her mouth slightly open, letting the saliva pool, letting her head loll just enough to signal exhaustion to the instructors patrolling in the safety truck behind them. She wasn't tired. That was the problem. Her heart rate was holding steady at 130 beats per minute, a jogging pace for her, a sprint for the others. She had to artificially degrade her form. She shortened her stride. She added a slight stumble every 100 yards. She forced her shoulders to slump, mimicking the metabolic failure of the recruits around her who were vomiting bile into the dry grass. She watched the heat waves. She listened to the boots. She waited for the miles to erode her mind, but her mind stayed cold, clear, and dangerously bored. Then the back gate opened. A white delivery truck turned onto the service road, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was a Sysco food service vehicle, the standard 5-ton box truck used for base supply. It rumbled past the platoon, heading for the galley, loading docks. Vance's eyes locked onto it. Reflex took over. Scan sector. Identify anomaly. The truck was wrong. It was 1,000 hours. Lunch prep. That truck should be loaded with pallets of frozen beef, cans of vegetables, and milk crates. It should be sitting heavy on its axles. The suspension should be compressed, the leaf springs flattened under the weight of 5 tons of cargo. It wasn't. The chassis was riding high, dangerously high. There was a visible 4-inch gap between the top of the rear tires and the wheel well. The floating tires bounced slightly as the truck hit a pothole. The springs extended and stiff. Physics didn't lie. That truck was empty. Why would a food service truck arrive at the start of the lunch shift carrying nothing but air? Vance kept running. She didn't break stride. She didn't stare. She used her peripheral vision, tracking the vehicle as it slowed at the checkpoint. The air brakes hissed. A sharp, angry release of pressure. The driver leaned out of the cab to hand his ID to the master-at-arms. He was wearing a sleeveless undershirt, his arm tanned and thick with muscle. He rested his elbow on the window frame, the bone protruding sharply. There was ink. Vance focused. The image was grainy through the heat haze, but the geometry was unmistakable. A spiderweb. It was tattooed directly over the elbow joint. The lines were thick, blue-black, fading at the edges. In the US Navy, a spiderweb usually meant you killed time in the brig. Or you just liked Spider-Man. But the placement was specific. On the point of the elbow, and the web had no spider. In the Russian criminal caste, the Vori v Zacconi, a spiderweb on the elbow meant you were a drug runner. A courier who didn't get caught. It was a badge of rank in an army that didn't wear uniforms. A Russian courier driving a Sysco truck onto a SEAL training base. With an empty cargo hold, the truck roared again, the engine whining as it accelerated past the checkpoint. The master-at-arms waved him through without checking the back. Why would he? It was just lunch. Vance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sweat drying on her skin. This wasn't a glitch. This was a pipeline. Empty in, full out. They weren't delivering food. They were extracting something. She felt the urge to stop, to memorize the license plate, to tackle the driver and break his arm to see if the ink went all the way to the bone The data screamed at her. Threat. Infiltration. Action required. She swallowed the urge. It tasted like bile. She couldn't act. She was Recruit Vance. Recruit Vance didn't know about Russian prison tattoos. Recruit Vance didn't know about suspension physics. Recruit Vance was just trying not to vomit on her boots. If she stopped, if she showed a spark of intelligence, Maddock would be on her, and the driver would see her face. So she did the hardest thing in the world. She looked away. She let her head drop. She let out a ragged, desperate gasp for air that sounded pathetic and real. File it. She ordered her brain. Timestamp 10:05. Object: Sysco truck. Anomaly: floating suspension. Marga: Vori spiderweb. She encrypted the file and buried it deep, under the layers of pain and heat. She kept running. A heavy rhythmic thudding of boots continued. Just another pair of boots on the ground. Day 15. The air over the obstacle course was thick with the smell of fresh sawdust and the sour tang of vomit baking on the asphalt. Vance hit the rope climb for the 9th time. Her arms were screaming. Not the dull ache of the grinder, but a sharp, acidic burning in her deltoids. Lactate accumulation was peaking. Her grip was failing. The hemp rope felt like a greased pipe. Move it? Vance. Maddox's voice cut through the haze of exhaustion. He was walking the perimeter, clean, dry. A sharp click sounded, followed by a mechanical clack. Rhythmic clicking and clacking. You're dragging anchor, he yelled. My grandmother climbs faster than that, and she's been dead 10 years. Vance didn't answer. She couldn't. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her vision was tunneling, the edges of the world greying out as her brain prioritized oxygen for the muscles over the eyes. She hauled herself over the top beam. The wood was rough, splinters digging into her raw palms. She dropped to the sand below. The impact jarred her spine, sending a jolt of nausea up her throat. Again, Maddock ordered. Lap 10. Go. Vance staggered. She looked at the other recruits. Most were sprawled in the dirt, heaving, broken. 2 were being attended to by the corpsman. She was the only one left standing. I said go. Maddock stepped closer. The clicking and clacking sounded faster. You want to quit? Ring the bell. Take the easy road. Oh, Vance shook her head. She wiped sweat from her eyes. Moving, Chief. She croaked. She started running. Her legs felt like they were packed with wet concrete. The quads burned with every step. The physics of fatigue were taking over. Her stride shortened. Her center of gravity wavered. She hit the low crawl. The sand ground into her elbows. She hit the balance beam. The world tilted. She was running on fumes. The mask of the mediocre recruit was heavy. But now, the fatigue was real. She wasn't acting anymore. She was surviving. Her conscious mind, the part that calculated angles and monitored heart rates, was shutting down to conserve energy. She was drifting into the grey zone. Autopilot. The zone where you didn't think. You just did. She approached the final obstacle. The wall. 8 feet of smooth plywood. Vertical. Unforgiving. In training, recruits were taught the scramble. Run up, plant a foot, jump, hook an armpit over the top, kick your legs, struggle, grunt, and heave your body weight over, like a sack of potatoes. It was ugly. It was loud. It was inefficient. Vance looked at the top edge. It seemed miles away. Her brain flickered. The tactical processor surged, bypassing the civilian emulation protocols. Obstacle detected. Vertical plane. Height, 2.4 meters. Velocity required, 4.5 meters per second. Technique, saut de bras. She accelerated. She didn't mean to. Her body just obeyed the oldest command in her nervous system. Overcome. She hit the wall. She didn't scramble. She didn't grunt. Her left foot planted high on the wood, converting horizontal momentum into vertical lift. Her hands shot up, grabbing the top edge, not with a desperate claw, but with a precise, symmetrical grip. In one fluid motion, she pulled. It wasn't a climb. It was a vault. A monkey vault. Her legs tucked tight to her chest. Her hips swung through the gap between her arms. Her body cleared the top edge without touching it. She floated for a fraction of a second at the apex, a silhouette against the sun. Perfect. Silent. Weightless. Then she dropped. She landed on the far side in a deep squat, absorbing the impact silently. No thud. No stumble. Just a soft huff of air and the crunch of sand. She stood up. The world rushed back in. The grey tunnel vision cleared. Mistake. The realization hit her harder than the ground. She hadn't struggled. She hadn't kicked. She had flowed over an 8-foot wall with the grace of a Tier 1 operator. The silence on the course was absolute. The heavy breathing of the other recruits seemed to stop. Vance turned slowly. Maddock was standing 10 feet away. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't moving. His hand was frozen halfway to his pocket. The Zippo was silent. He was staring at her. His eyes weren't angry anymore. They were wide, focused, stripping her down. He had seen the vault. He had seen the technique. Civilians didn't move like that. Fleet sailors didn't move like that. Only people who hunted other people moved like that. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had shattered. Maddox slowly closed the lighter. A sharp, mechanical clack sounded. The sound was like a gunshot. "Vance," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the drill instructor growl. "Mat room. Now." He turned and walked away. Vance watched him go. The sweat turned cold on her skin. She looked at her hands. They were trembling, not from fatigue, but from the adrenaline of exposure. She had survived the wall, but she had lost the war. The mat room smelled of industrial rubber, bleach, and the metallic tang of fierce sweat. It was a closed ecosystem of violence, walled off from the world by blue padding. The platoon sat in a circle, legs crossed, eyes down. They were the audience. Vance stood in the center. She was barefoot. Her feet gripped the textured vinyl. Maddox stepped onto the mat. He had removed his shirt. He was 50, but he was built like a slab of granite. Scars mapped his torso, bullet wounds, Shrapnel tears. A history of violence written on skin. He didn't look like an instructor anymore. He looked like a tank. Combative, Maddock announced. His voice echoed off the low ceiling. The enemy doesn't care about your feelings. The enemy wants to break you. Today, I am the enemy. He pointed a thick finger at Vance. You're up. Vance stepped forward. She kept her hands open. Low. Passive stance. The mask was back in place, but it felt thin, brittle. Are you, Chief? Don't I, chief me? Maddock growled. He circled her. I saw you on the wall. Vance. I saw that little trick. You think you're a gymnast? You think this is a playground? Oh, he lunged. It wasn't a demonstration speed. It was full velocity. A double-leg takedown meant to drive her through the floor. Vance didn't sprawl. She collapsed her hips, eating the impact, letting gravity do the work. She hit the mat hard. A heavy wham sound echoed. The air left her lungs in a sharp grunt. Maddock was on top of her instantly, forearm to the throat. Heavy, suffocating. Fight back, he roared, spit flying into her eyes. Where's that ninja move now? Show me. Vance flailed. She slapped at his shoulder. Weak, ineffectual. She feigned panic. She tried to buck him off with poor leverage. Pathetic. Maddox sneered. He stood up, hauling her with him by the collar of her t-shirt. He threw her toward the corner. Vance stumbled. She hit the padded wall and turned. Her chest was heaving. Her neck burned where his arm had crushed it. The pain was real, but the calculation was colder. Threat level: orange. Opponent is emotionally compromised. He is seeking a provocation. You're a liar, Vance, Maddox said. He walked toward her. He wasn't in a fighting stance. He was walking like a man approaching a dog he intended to kick. You're hiding in my navy. You're a tourist. A fraude. He stopped arm's length away. He invaded her personal space. I bet you've never been hit for real, he whispered. Then he raised his hand. It wasn't a fist. It was an open hand. A slap. It was the ultimate sign of disrespect. It said, "You are not a threat. You are a child." The movement started. His shoulder dropped. His hand accelerated. Something inside Kira Vance snapped. It wasn't a decision. It was a circuit breaker, tripping. The hypervigilance, the suppressed memories, the weeks of insults, they all compressed into a single, blinding millisecond of pure survival. Attack vector identified. Open hand strike. Right side. Velocity. High. Opening. Center line. The world slowed down. The dust motes in the air hung suspended. Vance didn't flinch away. She moved in. Her left shoulder rolled forward, slipping the slap by a fraction of an inch. The wind of his hand brushed her ear. She stepped into his guard. Her right hand shot out. Not a fist. A Y-hand formation. Thumb extended. Fingers rigoux. The web of the hand turned into a calcified wedge. Assassination Protocol Strike. Target. Larynx. She drove it upward. The target was his Adam's apple. It happened faster than thought. One moment Maddox was attacking. The next, Vance was inside his defense. Her hand, a blur of lethal intent. She stopped. Her hand froze exactly 1 centimeter from his throat. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Vance stood there, locked in the follow-through. Her knees were bent, weight sunk, structure perfect. Her eyes were dead cold. There was no fear in them, only the flat, predatory focus of a killer who had verified the target. Maddox blinked. He looked down. He saw the hand. He saw the strike that would have killed him. Then he saw her arm. Her t-shirt sleeve had ridden up during the lunge. On the inside of her bicep, stark against the pale skin, was a scar. It wasn't a jagged tear. It was a brand. A silver, triangular burn mark. The Veritas unit insignia. The mark of the Ghost Squads. Maddox knew that mark. He had seen it on body bags in places that didn't exist on maps. He looked back at her face. The recruit was gone. The woman standing in front of him was a weapon. Dead check. Chief. Vance whispered. Her voice was ice. You're open. Oh, Maddox didn't move. He didn't breathe. His face drained of colour, turning a sickly grey. The anger in his eyes was replaced by something else. Terror. Absolute. Primal terror. He realised he had just tried to slap a shark. He stepped back slowly. His hands came up, not to fight, but in a universal gesture of surrender. The silence was deafening. The recruits were staring, mouths open, unable to process what had just happened. Maddox cleared his throat. It sounded like tearing sandpaper. Freeze. X. He screamed. His voice cracked. Freeze? It was the safety kill word. The command that meant real-world emergency. Stop everything. Clear the deck. Maddox yelled, pointing at the door. His hand was shaking. Get out. All of you. Out. Now. The recruits scrambled. Panic infected them. They grabbed their gear and ran, sensing a disaster they didn't understand. The door slammed shut. Maddox and Vance were alone. The buzz of the light seemed incredibly loud. Vance slowly lowered her hand. She pulled her sleeve down, covering the scar. She stood at ease, but she didn't return to the recruit hunch. She stood tall. Maddox stared at her. He looked at the closed door, then back at her. He wiped sweat from his upper lip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his Zippo. A sharp click sounded. The flame flared. It wavered. His hand was trembling. He snapped it shut. A mechanical clack followed. Who the hell are you? He whispered. Vance didn't answer. She didn't have to. The scar had already told him everything. She just watched him, waiting for the handcuffs. The heavy steel door of the brig clanged shut, sealing the world into a box of dead air and darkness. Kira Vance sat on the edge of the metal cot, Her hands were behind her back, the plastic flex cuffs biting into her wrists. 2 sharp zipping sounds echoed in the quiet. The sound of the master-at-arms tightening them still echoed in her ears. It was a sharp, final sound. The sound of a career ending. She was numb again. Not the wet, metabolic freeze of the grinder, but the sterile, air-conditioned chill of confinement. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed with an annoying, intermittent flicker. A repetitive electrical buzz continued. It was rhythmic, maddening, like an insect trapped in the fixture. She closed her eyes. Her right shoulder ached. Adul, persistent reminder, where the adrenaline of the fight had masked the strain of the strike. The Y-hand had been perfect, but the stop had been brutal on her rotator cuff. The physics of halting lethal force at maximum velocity required her own body to absorb the kinetic energy she hadn't delivered to Maddox's throat. She tested the restraints. She twisted her wrists outward, applying torque against the plastic. A faint creak sounded. The zip ties dug in, pinching the ulnar nerve. A sharp, electric sting shot up her forearm. Solid. She wasn't getting out of these without a blade or a lighter. She wasn't a hero. She was a prisoner. There was no applause for showing restraint. There was only the cold reality of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Article 90. Assaulting a superior commissioned officer, or in this case, a senior chief. It didn't matter. The paperwork would be the same. The discharge would be dishonorable. The cover she had spent 6 months building was now ash. Voices filtered through the steel door. Muffled. Angry. She's my problem. Lieutenant. Mideg. My recruit. Maddock. His voice was rough, scraping against the silence. This is a Class A incident. Senior Chief. A younger, smoother voice replied. Jag. Or maybe the command duty officer. You called a freeze, X. That triggers a base-wide lockdown. You can't just sweep this under the rug. I didn't call it for a fight. Maddock lied. The desperation in his tone was palpable. I called it for a potential safety violation. I need time to assess. The logs are already pulled. Harlan. The Admiral is asking why the entire training command is paralyzed because 1E1 got frisky in the gym. Oh, Vance opened her eyes. She stared at the concrete floor. Paralyzed. The word hung in the air. The base was locked down. Freeze-X. It meant no movement. No pity. No vehicle traffic in or out of the main gates. Every recruit, every instructor, every support staff member was frozen in place, waiting for the all-clear. Except? Vance's mind rewinded. She shifted her weight on the thin mattress, the springs groaning under her. She pulled the file from the encrypted sector of her memory. Timestamp 10:05. Object Sysco truck. Anomaly floating suspension. Maga Vori spiderweb. The truck had entered empty at 1000 hours. It was now 1400 hours. A normal food service delivery took 45 minutes. Drop the pallets. Get the signature. Leave. The truck should have been gone hours ago. But if the truck was part of a pipeline, if the empty and full-out theory was correct, they needed a window to load the high-value cargo. They needed the warehouse personnel to be distracted. They needed the gates to be clear of random inspections. Vance leaned forward, resting her forehead against her knees. The smell of floor wax and old dust filled her nose. A base-wide lockdown was a nightmare for operations, unless you controlled the logistics. If you were stealing sensitive equipment, night vision, chips, weapons parts, you didn't want witnesses. You didn't want a random MP stopping you because your taillight was out. You wanted the MPs busy. You wanted them responding to a Class A incident at the gym. Vance's heart rate spiked. A quickening thud-thud followed. The Freeze X wasn't an obstacle for the smugglers. It was the cover. While the entire security force was converging on Maddock and the crazy recruit, the back channels would be silent. The supply warehouse would be a ghost town. The truck could load undisturbed. And when the lockdown lifted, or perhaps under the guise of essential supply movement authorized by a compromised insider, the truck would roll out. Heavy. She had just handed them the perfect diversion. The fight, the slap, the scar, it was all noise. And under the noise, the signal was moving. "Damn it," she whispered. She couldn't sit here. She couldn't wait for the lawyers. By the time they processed her, the truck would be on the I-5 north, and the cargo would be gone. She needed to speak to Maddock. Not as a recruit. As an Essel. But he was out there fighting for his own career, trying to bury the incident to save face. He wouldn't listen to a prisoner. He would listen to intelligence. She shifted on the cot again. She slid off the mattress and knelt on the cold concrete floor. The sudden movement sent a fresh jolt of pain through her shoulder. She ignored it. She pressed her ear against the floor. It was an old trick. Concrete carried sound better than air. Low-frequency vibrations travelled through the foundation. She closed her eyes and filtered out the buzz of the light, the voices in the hall, the throb of her own pulse. She listened for the hum, the deep, mechanical heartbeat of the base. If they were loading heavy cargo, they would need power. They would need the warehouse cranes. They would need the backup generators to cycle up if they cut the main grid to bypass the alarms. She waited. And then she heard it. Faint. Rhythmic. A rhythmic mechanical thrumming sound began. 60 hertz. A diesel generator cycling up under load. It wasn't coming from the barracks. It was coming from the north sector. Warehouse 4. The timeline fit. The logic held. Vance opened her eyes. The despair was gone. The cold calculation was back. She wasn't waiting for handcuffs anymore. She was waiting for Maddock to open that door. And when he did, she wasn't going to apologize. She was going to give him a briefing. The overhead light finally died. It wasn't a burnout. It was a power cut. The persistent electrical buzz vanished, plunging the cell into a silence so absolute it felt physical. Vance lay on the concrete floor. The cold seeped through her utility uniform, creating a numb patch on her cheek where it pressed against the rough seal. It smelled of floor wax, old dust, and the metallic tang of dried mop water. "Filter," she whispered. She began to strip the acoustic layers. Breath in, breath out. Ignore. Boot heel scuff in hallway. Pipes gurgling. Ignore. She pressed her right ear harder into the concrete, using her zygomatic arch as a conduction point. The foundation was a deep earth amplifier. The base was in lockdown. Freeze X. That meant all stop. No vehicles. No machinery. The grid should be quiet. The ambient hum of the transformers should be a flat line. But it wasn't. A ghost vibration rattled her jaw. It wasn't a sound she heard. It was a frequency she felt in the roots of her teeth. A heavy subsonic pulse continued. The chugging, mechanical beat of a large diesel engine under strain. She analyzed the signature. 1800 RPM. 60 Hertz. A backup generator. But why? The main power to the administration building was still on. She could see the light seeping under the door crack. Why would a generator be running? Then the pitch changed. The engine groaned. The RPMs dipped, then surged as the governor kicked in to compensate for a massive power draw. Load spike. Someone had just engaged a heavy electric motor. A crane. Or a high-speed winch. Vance mapped the acoustics. The vibration was coming from the north, through the bedrock. That ruled out the barracks. That ruled out the motor pool. North sector. Warehouse 4. The logistics hub. The logic locked into place. They hadn't just cut the alarms. They had cut the main power to the warehouse sector to bypass the electronic security logs, and now they were running on generator power to operate the loading cranes. The Sysco truck. The floating tires. The empty cargo hold. They weren't just stealing a few boxes. They were emptying the high-value cage. The floor shuddered beneath her ear. A steady, heavy load continued. Sustained operation. She checked her internal clock. 0200 hours. The dead of night. The perfect time for a heist that officially wasn't happening. Suddenly, the vibration stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The load was dropped. The generator was spooling down. The job was done. Vance sat up in the darkness. She rubbed the numb spot on her face. The truck was loaded. The evidence was packed. In a few hours, the sun would rise. The Freeze-X would be lifted, and that truck would roll out the back gate, blending into the morning supply run. She had the what? Theft. She had the where? Warehouse 4. She had the when? Now? But she was locked in a box. She looked at the door. There was no handle on the inside. No keypad to hack. No vent to crawl through. This wasn't a movie. It was a Brig. She needed a key. And the only key was the man who hated her guts. She needed Maddock. She leaned back against the wall, listening to the silence of the base. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of a crime scene. Come on, Harlan, she whispered into the dark. Be smart. Come back. Oh, she waited. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, counting the minutes, refining the briefing she would give him. It had to be perfect. One shot. One chance to turn him. If he didn't come by dawn, the truck would be gone. And she would be just another disgraced recruit in handcuffs. Morning light, grey and weak, finally cut through the high, barred window. It illuminated the dust motes, dancing in the stale air of the cell. Vance sat on the cot, back straight, hands still cuffed behind her. She had been awake for 28 hours. Her eyes felt like they were packed with sand, but her mind was a razor. The heavy steel bolt of the door clanked. The door swung open. Senior Chief Harlan Maddox stepped in. He looked like hell. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red. His uniform was rumpled, lacking its usual crisp creases. He smelled of old sweat, stress, and fresh black coffee. He didn't scream. He didn't posture. He just stood there, filling the doorway, holding his Zippo in a white-knuckled grip. He didn't click it. "JAG wants your head," Maddox said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "They want to know why a recruit knows Defendu. They want to know why I shouldn't be court-martialed for losing control of my deck." Oh, he stepped closer, invading her space, but careful to stay out of striking range. The fear from the mat room was gone, replaced by a weary, dangerous anger. "So," he said softly, "you have 5 minutes to tell me who you really are before I hand you over to the MPs. And don't lie to me. Vance? I'm done with lies." Napovoy. Vance didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg for mercy. She looked him in the eye, shifting gears instantly from prisoner to analyst. "Sir," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, stripped of all emotion. "You are being played." Maddox blinked. He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "I'm being played? You're the one in cuffs." "Oh, the freeze, X?" Vance continued, ignoring his outburst. "You called it at 1400. The base locked down. All MP assets were diverted to the gym to handle the Class A incident. The perimeter patrols were static." "I know what a lockdown is," Maddox snapped. "I ordered it." At 10:05 yesterday, a Sysco delivery truck entered the back gate. It was off schedule. It was riding high on its suspension. Floating tires. 4-inch gap in the wheel wells. It was empty. Maddox frowned. His thumb brushed the wheel of the Zippo, but he didn't spark it. He was listening, but his hand drifted slightly toward his holster. A food truck entering at lunch prep should be heavy. 5 tons of cargo. Springs compressed. Basic physics. So the driver forgot a pallet. So what? The driver had a spider web on his elbow. Vance said. "No spider. That's a courier mark. Organized crime. Oui, vory v zákoně." She didn't say the Russian words. She let the implication land. Maddox went still. The air in the room seemed to tighten. The Zippo in his hand shook once, a metallic rattle. "You're hallucinating," he muttered, but there was no conviction in it. He looked like he wanted to hit something. Or someone. "At 0200 this morning," Vance said. "While you were arguing with JAG, the backup generator for Warehouse 4 cycled up. I heard the load spike through the floor. 60 Hz hum Heavy electric motors. Cranes. She leaned forward, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. They used your lockdown as cover, Chief. They needed the MPs busy. They needed the supply lanes clear. While everyone was looking at us, they emptied the high-value cage. Maddox stared at her. His knuckles were white around the lighter. Night vision, chips, guidance sets. Whatever is in Warehouse 4 that fits in a 5-ton box truck. Vance dropped her voice to a whisper. That truck is leaving when the lockdown lifts. If it clears the gate, the gear is gone. And you will be the senior chief who created the diversion that let it happen. Maddox looked at the Zippo. He looked at the door. He looked back at Vance. He remembered the truck. He had seen it pass the window of his office yesterday. He hadn't noted the suspension, but he remembered the sound. Empty metal rattling. And he remembered the feeling he'd had for weeks, that something on his base was rotting from the inside. Floating tires? He asked. His voice was barely audible. Springs fully extended. Vance confirmed. Physics doesn't lie. Maddox closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He wasn't a detective, but he was a SEAL. And he knew when a perimeter had been breached. He opened his eyes. They were clear now. Focused. If you're wrong, he said, I will bury you under the jail. I'm not wrong, Vance said. Maddox stepped forward. He reached behind her back. A sharp click sounded. The handcuffs fell away. Vance rubbed her wrists. The blood rushed back into her hands, stinging like fire. She stood up. Maddox didn't step back. He handed her the Zippo. Prove it, he said. 10 minutes later, the rain had started again, drumming a nervous, erratic rhythm against the metal roof of Maddox's office. Maddox sat behind his desk, the blue light of the monitor washing over his face, highlighting the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. Vance stood behind him, just inside the periphery of his vision. She was rubbing her wrists, but her eyes were locked on the screen. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the hard drive and the intensified rain. It felt less like a workspace and more like a bunker. NSIPS gate logs, Maddox muttered, his fingers heavy on the keys. Back gate. 0400 to present. I'm in. He hit enter. The system cycled. A spinning wheel of death continued. Then the data populated. Maddox squinted. He leaned in closer. That's impossible, he whispered. The log was there, but there were gaps. Clean, surgical excisions in the timeline. 03:55. Patrol, check. 04:15. Patrol check. Between 03:55 and 04:15, there was nothing. No entries. No motion sensor triggers. No automated license plate scans. It wasn't a glitch. It was a purge. They wiped it, Vance said softly. 20-minute window. Enough time to move a truck out if the gates were manually overridden. Maddox slammed his fist onto the desk. The coffee mug jumped. This is a closed-loop system. He snarled. You need level 4 clearance to edit the logs. The only person with that key besides the CO is... He stopped. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The supply officer. Vance finished for him. Lieutenant Keller. Maddox spun his chair around. His face was a mask of fury. Keller signs the MP dispatch orders. He controls the shift rotations. If I call the MPs, the call goes through his desk. Ominous, exactly. Vance said. You pick up that phone. You tell him we know. He alerts the truck. They ditch the cargo, burn the vehicle, and you're left with a deleted log and a conspiracy theory. Maddox stared at the phone. It looked radioactive. He was the senior chief of the training command. He was supposed to be the ultimate authority on this deck. But in this moment, he was completely, utterly isolated. The chain of command had been weaponized against him. So we're alone, he said. It wasn't a question. We have surprise. Vance countered. They think the base is paralyzed. They think you're busy writing incident reports about the crazy recruit. They aren't expecting a hunter. If we fail, they bury us both. She didn't say it aloud, but the thought hung in the air between them. Her handlers wouldn't extract a corpse. Maddox studied her. He looked past the ill-fitting recruit uniform, past the bruised wrists. He saw the way she stood, balanced, ready, scanning the room. Pure operator. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked to the heavy steel locker in the corner. He spun the combination dial. Left, right, left. The latch clicked. He pulled the door open. The smell of CLP, cleaner, lubricant, preservative, wafted out, sharp and chemical. It was the smell of readiness. Inside, a rack of M4 carbines sat cold and black. On the top shelf, a Sig Sauer P2 .26 pistol rested in its holster. Maddox reached in. His hand hovered over the carbines. His gaze shifted to Vance. If he armed her, he was handing a weapon to a prisoner. If she was lying, if this was some elaborate ISA mind game, he would be ending his career and possibly his life. But the logs were gone. The truck was real. And the gut feeling that had been gnawing at him for weeks finally had a name. He grabbed the Sig Sauer. He checked the chamber. 2 sharp mechanical clacks sounded. Loaded. He holstered it on his own hip. He reached back into the locker and grabbed a Motorola tactical radio. He didn't grab a second gun. He turned to Vance. He held out the radio. I'm not giving you a weapon, he said, his voice hard. You're still a recruit under investigation. Vance didn't blink. She took the radio. She checked the channel. I don't need a weapon, Chief, she said. I need a driver. Maddox scrutinized her for a second longer. He was looking for a crack, a sign of deceit. He found only cold, professional competence. One wrong move, Vance, he said, pointing a finger at her chest. One sign that you're playing me, and I will drop you myself. Are we clear? Crystal? Vance said. She clipped the radio to her belt. The truck will be heading for the old service road. It bypasses the main checkpoint. If we leave now, we can cut them off at the perimeter fence. On after, Maddox grabbed his keys. He grabbed his cover. He shoved the Zippo into his pocket. You navigate, he ordered, moving toward the door. I drive. They stepped out into the rain. The base was silent, locked down, at asleep. But the hunt was awake. The back gate was a jagged scar in the perimeter fence. An odd, rusted service exit leading to the civilian highway. The rain was torrential now. A vertical wall of water that turned the world into a slick, monochromatic blur. Maddox's truck skidded to a halt, blocking the narrow access road. The tires spun in the mud, throwing up a rooster tail of sludge. 30 yards ahead, the Sysco delivery truck was idling at the gate. Its headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the chain-link barrier. The driver was out of the cab, working on the padlock with bolt cutters. Stay down, Maddox ordered. He killed the engine. He stepped out into the storm. He didn't draw his weapon yet. He walked toward the truck, his hands visible, his posture projecting the absolute authority of a senior chief on his own ground. Secure that vehicle, Maddox roared over the wind. Step away from the gate. The driver froze. He turned slowly. Even in the rain, the spiderweb tattoo on his elbow was a dark smudge against his skin. The passenger door of the truck opened. Lieutenant Keller, the supply officer, stepped down. He was wearing a poncho, but his hand was tucked inside it, gripping something heavy. Chief Maddox, Keller shouted. His voice was thin, nervous. We have a special dispatch. Emergency supply run. Get that truck out of the way. Gate logs are down. Sir, Maddox yelled back. He kept walking, closing the distance. No movement during freeze, X. You know the protocol. I am the protocol, Keller snapped. He pulled a pistol from under his poncho. Back off, Chief. That's a direct order. In quote, the driver dropped the bolt cutters. He reached into the cab and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. Maddox stopped. He was 10 yards away. 2 shooters. No cover. He was outgunned. You're making a mistake, Lieutenant, Maddox said. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. His hand drifted toward his holster. Don't be a hero, Harlan, Keller said, raising the gun. Just get back in your car and forget you saw this. Maddox didn't move. He stared at them. He was the distraction. The buzz of the sodium perimeter lights overhead was a deafening electric hum in the rain. A continuous electrical buzz continued. It masked the sound of the shadow moving along the fence line. Vance wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a sailor. In this moment, she was a ghost. She had exited the truck before it stopped, rolling into the ditch, moving through the high grass like smoke. She approached from the blind side, using the deafening noise of the rain and the lights to cloak her footsteps. She came up behind Keller. She didn't shout. She didn't warn him. She moved. Her left hand clamped over Killer's gun hand, pointing the muzzle at the mud. Her right arm snaked around his elbow joint. A sickening mechanical crack sounded. The sound of the bone breaking was dry and audible even over the rain. Keller screamed. The gun dropped into the mud. Vante spun him, using his body as a shield. The driver swung the shotgun. Maddock was already moving. He drew his 6-hour in one fluid motion. 2 sudden bangs erupted. Both hit the engine block of the truck, shattering the radiator. Steam exploded into the air, blinding the driver. "Drop it," Maddock roared. "Drop it, or the next one is in your chest." The driver hesitated. Through the steam, his eyes weren't filled with rage, but with the weary resignation of a hired hand who knew the job was blown. He looked at the gun, then at Maddock. It wasn't worth dying for. He dropped the shotgun. He raised his hands. Vance shoved Keller into the mud. She kicked the pistol away. She stood over him, breathing hard, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She looked at Maddock through the steam and the rain. It was over. The adrenaline dump hit them both. The silence returned, heavier than before, punctuated only by Keller's moans and the hiss of the dying engine. Then, blue lights flashed in the distance. Sirens wailed, cutting through the night. The MPs were coming. Finally, Maddock holstered his weapon. He looked at Vance. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask, to thank her. But headlights swept across them from the other direction. A black Suburban pulled up on the civilian side of the fence. It had no plates. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like oil. The passenger door opened. A man in a suit stepped out. He didn't look at Maddock. He looked at Vance. He gave a single, court nod. Vance turned to Maddock. There was no romance in her eyes. No warmth. Just the cold, hard respect of one predator acknowledging another. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the Zippo. She tossed it to him. Maddock caught it. The metal was warm from her hand. "Vance?" he said. It was the first time he had said her name without an insult attached. She didn't answer. She didn't salute. She turned and walked toward the fence. She vaulted it in one smooth motion, the same monkey vault that had exposed her. She landed on the other side. She paused for a second, looking back through the mesh. For a heartbeat, the recruit mask dropped completely, revealing the exhausted woman underneath. Then she turned away. She walked to the Suburban and got in. The door slammed shut. The Suburban U turned and vanished into the rain, heading for the highway. The MP cruisers skidded to a halt. Doors opened. Boots hit the ground. "Chief, secure the scene." Hands in the air. And Maddock stood alone in the rain, the steam swirling around his legs. Keller was groaning in the mud. The truck was dead. The base was safe. He looked at the empty road where the Suburban had been. He looked down at the Zippo in his hand. A sharp click sounded. The flame defied the storm. "Ghost," he whispered. He snapped the lighter shut. A mechanical clack followed. He turned to face the MPs. "I'm Senior Chief Maddock," he said, his voice steady as rock. "I have 2 suspects in custody. Secure the deck." The rain washed the blood into the earth, leaving nothing behind but the silence.